The call came at 6:47 in the morning, while I was still in my scrubs from the night shift, eating cold pad dye over the sink. It was the charge nurse at St. Bridget's. One of the orderlies had called in sick. Could I cover the private wing from 7 to 3? I said yes before she finished the sentence. The private wing paid differently. Not a lot, but enough to matter when you were 3 months behind on your car insurance and pretending you weren't. I rinsed my fork, changed into a clean set of scrubs, and drove through the gray October morning, thinking about nothing in particular. That's the thing about exhaustion. It flattens everything. I wasn't thinking about Connor. I hadn't thought about Connor in almost 2 weeks, which felt like an achievement worth noting. I should have known better than to keep score. St. Bridget's private wing was on the 4th floor, separated from the rest of the hospital by a set of keycard doors and a different kind of quiet. The carpet was thicker up there. The lighting was warmer. The rooms had windows that looked out over the river instead of the parking structure. I'd worked the floor maybe a dozen times over the past year, always as a fill-in, always aware that I was slightly out of my element. The patients were different. Not sicker, necessarily. Just more accustomed to a certain standard of care that I was still learning to deliver without feeling like I was performing it. I got my assignment from the charge nurse, a precise woman named Ruth, who communicated mostly in raised eyebrows and clipboard taps. 4 rooms, routine checks, vitals, medication rounds. Nothing complicated. Room 412 was a post-surgical patient, name on the chart, V. Marchetti. No other information on the whiteboard. Just the name, and a small red dot that meant private security clearance, which I had seen exactly once before, for a provincial cabinet minister who'd had a knee replaced, and was very particular about his morphine schedule. I knocked on the door of 412 the way I always knocked. 2 quick raps, a pause, then the handle. The man sitting up in the bed was not what I expected. He was maybe 45. Though he had the kind of face that might have looked exactly the same at 35 and could plausibly look the same at 60. Dark hair going silver at the temples. A jaw that looked like it had been assembled with a specific purpose in mind. The hospital gown looked absurd on him, the way a circus tent looks absurd draped over a piece of architecture. His left arm was bandaged from elbow to shoulder, and he had the particular stillness of someone who was in real pain and had decided some time ago not to let it show. There were 2 men in the room with him, both standing, both wearing suits that were too well fitted for hospital visitors. One was near the window, one was near the door. Neither of them looked at me like I was a nurse. They looked at me like I was a variable that needed to be assessed. "Good morning," I said. "I'm your nurse today. I'm just going to check your vitals and go over your medications." The man in the bed looked at me steadily, not rudely, just completely, the way some people look at things when they're deciding whether to pay attention. "Of course," he said. His voice was quiet, accented slightly. Eastern European, I thought, though smoothed by years of something else. Go ahead. His name, I learned from his chart, was Vasil Marchetti, admitted 2 days earlier. The nature of his injury was listed as a laceration requiring surgical repair, which was the kind of careful language that told you exactly nothing, and quite a lot simultaneously. His blood pressure was slightly elevated. His temperature was normal. He answered my questions in complete sentences, which sounds like a small thing but isn't. You'd be surprised how many people stop being able to form complete sentences when they're frightened or in pain. Vasil Marchetti was neither. "Are you in any pain?" I asked. "Some," he said. "On a scale of 1 to 10, ought 4. I made a note. "I can bring something for that. Later," he said, not dismissive, just certain about what he wanted and when he wanted it. I finished the check, noted everything, said I'd be back in 2 hours. At the door, one of the suited men moved slightly to let me pass. I nodded at him the way you nod at doors when you're not sure what else to do. Ruth was at the nursing station when I came back. "Everything fine in 412? "Fine," I said. Slightly elevated BP. He declined pain management for now. She nodded like this was expected. "He's particular," she said. "Don't take it personally." I wasn't. I had bigger things to take personally. The morning passed the way. Mornings on that floor tended to pass, quietly, methodically, in 15-minute intervals. I was finishing a note at the station around 10:30 when I heard the elevator open behind me. I didn't look up right away. Visitors came and went. It wasn't my business. Then I heard his voice. I'd know it anywhere. That's the thing about people who've shaped the way you think about yourself. You don't get to unlearn the sound of them. Connor's voice was medium-pitched and slightly too smooth, the voice of someone who'd learned early that sounding reasonable was more effective than being reasonable. I'd spent 2 years thinking that voice was safe. "I'm looking for a patient," he said to whoever was at the desk. "Cassidy Verne. She's a nurse here." My stomach dropped through the floor. I made myself stand up slowly. I turned around slowly, because if I moved like prey, I would become it. He saw me at the same moment I turned, and the expression on his face. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because I've had a long time to think about it. It wasn't rage. Rage would have been simpler. It was something more possessive than that. The expression of someone who sees an object that had wandered out of its designated place and intends to return it there. "Cass," he said, like we were running into each other at the grocery store. Like the last 3 months of blocked numbers and locked doors hadn't happened. "I've been trying to reach you. You need to leave," I said. My voice was steady. I was proud of that then and now. "I just want to talk. This is my workplace. You need to leave." He took a step toward me, and the thing is, this is the part that's hardest to explain to people who haven't been in it. The thing is that I knew, with complete certainty, that if I stepped back, it would be over. He would understand that I still responded to his pressure the way I always had, and that knowledge would undo everything I'd built since I left. So I didn't step back. He reached out and took my wrist. Not hard enough to bruise. That was always how it went. Never quite hard enough. The grip that says I am holding you and you will not make a scene because you are reasonable and you know this isn't worth the scene. "Get your hand off me," I said. "Lower your voice. Get your hand off me right now." He tightened his grip just slightly. And then, I heard the door of room 412 open down the hall. I don't know what made me look. Instinct, maybe. Or just the small animal awareness of anything that might change the shape of the moment. One of the suited men was standing in the doorway. He wasn't moving toward us. He was just standing there, looking at Connor with an expression I would think about later. In the way you think about things you didn't fully understand until you're safe enough to. Connor saw him too. He let go of my wrist. "I'll find you somewhere else," he said quietly. Like a promise. He turned and walked back to the elevator. I stood at the nursing station and breathed for a moment. Ruth appeared from around the corner, with the particular timing of someone who had seen something and was deciding whether to acknowledge it. "Do you need to make a report?" she asked. No preamble, no softening. "Yes," I said. "I do." I filed the incident report that afternoon. I'd filed one before, at the walk-in clinic where I used to work 8 months ago. The first time Connor had shown up somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. That report had gone into a folder. The folder had presumably gone into a filing cabinet. Nothing had come of it. This felt different. The security team at St. Bridget's was thorough. They took my statement carefully. They flagged my employee file so that the front desk would know not to give out information about my schedule or my location within the building. They told me I could apply for a peace bond, a restraining order, through the Ontario Court of Justice at no cost, and that they had a liaison who could walk me through it. I took the liaison's card. I put it in my pocket. I intended to call. I went back to finish my shift. At 2:30, I was updating charts when I heard a knock on the nursing station divider. I looked up. Vasile Marchetti was standing on the other side of it, which was not supposed to be possible. Post-surgical patients in the private wing were not supposed to be walking the hallway unaccompanied, particularly ones with security details and red dots on their charts. He was wearing a hospital robe over his gown, and his bare feet were probably violating 6 different protocols. One of the suited men was approximately 6 steps behind him, which was the expression, I understood, of someone who had given up arguing. "You should be in your room," I said. "Yes," he agreed. He didn't move. I set down my pen. "Mr. Marchetti, Vasile, I need you to go back to your room." He looked at me for a moment with that same complete steadiness. "The man from this morning," he said. "He's done this before. It wasn't a question." I didn't answer it. "There are people who know how to make certain things more difficult," he said carefully. For certain kinds of men. A pause. I'm not suggesting anything you haven't already done through proper channels. I'm suggesting that proper channels sometimes move slowly, and that, in the meantime, there are other options. I stared at him. Are you offering to have someone intimidated on my behalf? The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. I'm offering to ensure that a specific person understands that some spaces are no longer available to him. That's the same thing. It's a different mechanism. I should have said no. I know how that reads. I know the version of this story where I report the odd patient to hospital administration, finish my shift, go home, lock my door, and begin the slow legal process of making Connor understand that I meant what I said. I know that version. I had been living that version. What would that look like? I heard myself say. Like nothing you would ever need to know about. I went home that evening thinking I'd imagined the whole conversation. I made tea. I called the liaison from the card in my pocket and left a message about starting the peace bond application. I ate toast. I went to bed. The next morning, Connor texted from a number I didn't recognize. Don't bother. That was all. 2 words. I read them 4 times. I didn't text back. I went to work. I covered the private wing twice more that week, which was 2 more times than I usually did. Ruth seemed to be scheduling me there with a deliberateness she didn't explain, and I didn't ask about. On Wednesday, Vasile Marchetti's blood pressure was down to normal range, and he had allowed me to bring him something for the pain, which I took as a sign of progress. He asked me questions while I worked. Not intrusive ones, small ones. How long had I been a nurse? Did I prefer night shifts or day shifts? Whether I'd grown up in the city? I answered them. I'm not sure why. Maybe because they were the kind of questions that assumed I had a life outside of what had just happened to me. And I was hungry for that assumption. You grew up here? He said. Sudbury, I said. Moved to Toronto for school. Stayed for the lake. Lake Ontario, he said, like he was testing the words. I know it's not much of a lake by international standards. No, he said. But it looks like the sea in November. I noticed it when I first came here. How long ago was that? He considered. 17 years. Do you miss where you came from? Parts of it, he said. The parts that still exist. There was something in the way he said it. Not sad, exactly. More like someone who had done their grieving at the appropriate time and had arrived at something quieter on the other side. I understood that feeling better than I expected to. On Friday, the peace bond application went through. I received a confirmation by email and a follow-up call from the liaison, explaining what would happen next, what Connor would be served with, and what I should do if he violated the conditions. I saved the liaison's number in my phone as a contact. I made a folder on my desktop. I did the things you're supposed to do when you're doing it right. Connor did not text again. He did not appear at the hospital again. He did not appear anywhere. I told myself this was the legal process working, which it might have been. I told myself the peace bond alone had been enough, which it might have been. I had no evidence of anything else, and I didn't look for it. Vasile was discharged on a Saturday. I wasn't working that day. I found out on Monday when I checked the board and his room was listed as available. Something in my chest moved sideways. I noticed it. I didn't act on it. 2 weeks passed, then 3. The days got shorter. The lake turned the color he'd described, gray and immense, and not quite like a lake at all. I started sleeping better. I stopped flinching at unknown numbers. I made a point of going to the farmer's market on Saturday mornings, which I'd stopped doing sometime in the last year of my relationship with Connor, because he'd had opinions about the farmer's market that had made it easier to stay home. The small recoveries. Nobody talks about those. The first Saturday you buy yourself flowers without thinking about whether someone will have something to say about it. The first morning you wake up and don't immediately audit the previous night for anything that might have been a mistake. I was carrying flowers and a paper bag of sourdough across the market on a Saturday in early November when someone said my name. I turned around. Vasile was standing near the preserves booth in a coat that was several grades above anything else in the vicinity. The bandage was gone from his arm. He looked like himself, which is to say he looked like someone who had never once in his life been a patient anywhere. You're not supposed to be on your feet yet, I said. Habit. I'm cleared, he said. 2 weeks ago. How's the arm? Healed. He said it simply, like it was a settled matter. Then, after a beat, "You look better. Than what? Than the last time I saw you." I thought about what to say to that. Around us, the market moved. Someone calling out prices, the smell of wood smoke from the pastry tent, two dogs trying to get into the same garbage can with different strategies. Normal Saturday. Normal city. "I filed the peace bond," I said. "It went through." "I know," he said. And then, because I looked at him, "I asked Ruth how you were doing. She told me you'd managed the situation. You asked my charge nurse about me." "I asked a mutual acquaintance," he said. "It's different." I laughed. I hadn't expected to, but I did. "Is it?" "Marginally," he said. We stood there in the middle of the market for a moment. He wasn't pushing. That was the thing I kept noticing about him. The absolute absence of pressure. Every person I'd known who wanted something from me had pushed, in whatever direction suited them, until I'd learned to brace automatically against the next push. Vasile just stood there, holding a jar of what appeared to be wild blueberry preserves, waiting to see what I would do. "I'm going to get coffee," I said. "There's a place at the end of the row that's good." "All right," he said. We walked there together. He bought the preserves. I bought coffee and 2 butter tarts, because it was November, and that's what you do in November in Ontario. We sat on a bench near the water feature that wasn't running because of the cold and drank our coffee while the city moved around us. He told me, in the careful way I was learning was his natural register, that he owned several businesses in the city, that the injury had been a professional matter, now resolved, that he had a house in the annex that he'd bought because it had a good library and had only gradually realized was far too large for one person. I told him about Sudbury, about nursing school, about the particular quality of light on Lake Superior in July, which is a thing I've never successfully explained to anyone who hasn't seen it. "I'd like to," he said. "See it?" "Yes." I looked at him. "That's a 5-hour drive." "I'm aware of that." I turned back to the water feature, which was sitting dry and patient in its concrete basin, waiting for a warmer season. Somewhere behind us, the 2 dogs had apparently resolved their garbage dispute and were now moving together in the direction of the pastry tent, unified by a common purpose. "Ask me again in the spring," I said. He was quiet for a moment. When I looked over, he was watching the lake, or the piece of it visible between the buildings. With that particular expression, I'd seen the first time in his room at St. Bridget's. Like someone who'd made their peace with distance and had stopped pretending it didn't sometimes still cost something. "I can do that," he said. I finished my coffee. He walked me to my car, which was parked on a side street off the market, and we stood for a moment on the sidewalk in the ordinary gray November morning, and he said goodbye the way people say goodbye, when they mean something more careful than "see you later," and something less committal than "see you soon." I drove home with my flowers and my sourdough and my butter tarts, and I sat in my kitchen for a while without turning on the television or the radio, which is something I'd been doing lately. Learning to be comfortable with quiet again. Learning to trust that silence didn't mean something was wrong. Spring came late that year, as it always does in Ontario, arriving in fits of cold rain and sudden green and the smell of earth that's been held under ice for 6 months and is finally remembering what it's for. He asked me again in April. We drove up on a Friday, taking the long route through Muskoka because I wanted him to see the shield, the rock and the pine, and the way the lakes appear between the trees like interruptions, like the land never fully committed to being land. He was a quiet traveler. He looked at things carefully. He asked questions that showed he'd been paying attention. We stayed 2 nights. I showed him the lake at dawn, when the light comes in low and turns everything copper, and the horizon disappears into water and sky until you genuinely can't tell where one ends and the other begins. He stood beside me on the dock and was quiet for a long time. "You tried to explain it," he said finally. "I know. You were right. It doesn't translate." "No," I said. "Some things you just have to see." He turned to look at me then, and the morning was very still. And somewhere across the water, a loon called once and went quiet. And I understood. And I understood in the way you understand things that you've been slowly understanding for months without letting yourself finish the thought. That I had stopped bracing. Not because he'd made me feel safe in the way Connor had always promised to, and never delivered, but because he'd done the harder thing. He'd just been consistently, quietly, unremarkably present. He'd ask me about Superior when I'd mentioned it like something I'd given up. He'd waited in a farmer's market in November, without pushing. He'd driven 5 hours without suggesting that I owed him anything for doing it. I reached over and took his hand. He didn't say anything. He just held on, the way people hold on when they're not performing it for anyone, when it means exactly what it is and nothing more complicated. The loon called again. We stood there until the sun was fully up, and the lake was just a lake again, massive, indifferent, beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they don't need you to tell them so. That's the thing nobody says about starting over. It doesn't feel like starting over. It feels like arriving somewhere you didn't know you'd been traveling toward. Like all the mornings you white-knuckled through, and all the evenings you relearned how to sit with yourself were actually the road, and you just couldn't see it from inside them. I couldn't, anyway, but I can see it now.